Okay, I think most of the participants are joining. I'm sure others will be coming on in as we get started today, but we have a packed agenda for you, so we don't want to wait too long to dive in on the amazing content today. So continue to please share in that chat box where you're coming in from, maybe what organization you're with, whatever you'd like to say. Hello, we're so glad you were here with us. And we're so pleased to have so many people. We have over 700 in the room. We had almost 1,500 people sign up to receive the report and the recording of this session. There's clearly a lot of interest in strategic volunteer engagement. So we're just excited to have you with us this afternoon for a preview of 2 incredible pieces of research for our field and to be able to officially launch the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement. So I am thrilled to be with you and to be one of the hosts today. My name is Betsy McFarland, and I serve with my colleague Jeff Glabaki as a co-director of this initiative. And just a couple of quick housekeeping items as we're getting started today. The first is, as you can see, you are welcome to use the chat to share thoughts, communicate with one another. But if you have questions of our speakers today, we're going to ask that you please use the Q&A feature. It's located in the Zoom menu bar. And specifically, we want you to put questions in the Q&A because we're worried with this many people. It's a great problem to have, but with this many people in the room, we're going to lose track of all the questions that might show up in the chat box. So feel free to use chat to communicate, have some fun. Use the Q&A for submitting your actual questions that you would like the panelists to consider answering, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we possibly can, both in writing and also when we have the Q&A section with our panelists coming up after the presentations. So we also welcome you, as I'm seeing a few people have already found, to use the reactions emojis that are located in that Zoom menu. You can give us some real-time feedback on what you're hearing. So give that a try. I love it, seeing those thumbs up and the excitement. So let's get started. So the Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement is really all about transforming the future of volunteerism. And through practical research-informed tools and resources, we're working to inspire nonprofits to intentionally engage their volunteer networks and encourage funders to invest in strategic volunteer engagement in order to help organizations to meet their missions. And as part of this initiative, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the credible partners who funded the research and who helped make all of this possible. And they include the Leedy Foundation, the Lodestar Foundation, Volunteer Match, the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, and UJA-Federation of New York. Amazing partners who've been along on this journey with us. And we'd also like to give a special shout out to our friends at the independent sector who provided some technical assistance with the research. And also we want to express our sincere appreciation to the Fidelity Charitable Trust Initiative, whose support is in part making the dissemination of this research possible. And last but not least, we'd like to offer our sincere thanks to our research partners, Dr. Nathan Dietz with the Do Good Institute at the University of Maryland's School of Public Policy, and Dr. Sue Carter Kahl, who are both here with us today, along with one of our amazing speakers, Rina Cohen from UJA-Federation of New York. So without further ado, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Jeff, to talk just a bit more about the initiative and to introduce our first speaker.
Thanks, Betsy. My name is Jeff Glabaki. I am based in Tucson, Arizona, and share my co-initiative directorship with Betsy. We can't tell you how excited we are today to get the response that we've had to the registration. So welcome, everybody. The Initiative for Strategic Volunteer Engagement, we are proposing an expanded definition of how nonprofit organizations and funders get things done. We are envisioning a social sector that embraces strategic volunteer engagement, not as a program, but as a strategy for mission accomplishment. This is a social sector we envision where volunteers are a renewable resource, critical to that mission accomplishment. We see nonprofit organizations, whether you are large or small, embracing best practice in volunteer engagement, and a social sector where the funding community provides the support that organizations need to maximize volunteer energy. So we're here today to talk about this groundbreaking research, strategic volunteer engagement that's been commissioned by the initiative. But today we're also launching a national communications campaign to advance strategic volunteer engagement. Again, as a strategy for nonprofit organizations and funders alike to increase their impact. And we do want to give a tip of the hat to the Chronicle of Philanthropy for their January 31st story on the qualitative research that you'll be hearing about momentarily. And today's story in the Chronicle, if you saw Philanthropy Today, the research report on the quantitative surveys. We really think that these research findings are going to revolutionize how the social sector, nonprofits and funders alike, think about and act on strategic volunteer engagement for mutual benefit. So let's get started. I'm really pleased to introduce you to Rina Cohen. She's Senior Planning Executive at UJA-Federation of New York. And there, Rina leads the organization's strategic volunteerism portfolio. She's heard this before from the funding partners, but I think it's really important to put a big exclamation mark on that today, that Rina's work is an exemplar of how funders can embed strategic volunteer engagement in their work and how funders can support their grant partners in elevating their efforts and accomplishments. At UJA, Rina's helped steward more than $10 million in grants to build volunteer infrastructure at over 30 nonprofit agencies. She's managed UJA's unrestricted funding application process to their 60 core partners, totaling $34 million in communal investments. She was responsible for designing and realizing the grant process for community-based organizations as part of UJA's COVID vaccine education and access effort and the Census 2020 teams. She's expanded her role at UJA as of last year to lead the new Sephardic and Mizrahi inclusion team to elevate those communities in UJA's grant-making divisions. And last but not least, Rina completed her master's in nonprofit management at the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU and her bachelor's degree at Barnard College. So Rina, thank you for being with us today, and thank you for sharing your really amazing, amazing story.
Thank you, Betsy and Jeff. Thrilled to be here today with everyone. Let's have a good time and learn a little bit more about UJA's work in the space of strategic volunteerism. Okay, so firstly, UJA recognized strategic volunteerism as a vital asset and critical to an organization's ability to achieve its mission. Using volunteers strategically, and we've seen this during COVID especially, builds more people-centered, dynamic, sustainable organizations with the capacity to meet growing needs. So what is UJA-Federation of New York? Nice to see some grantees on our call today, but for those who are not familiar, it's a philanthropy based in New York, caring for all people in need across New York, responding to global crises, and helping to shape our Jewish future. We're a very complicated organization with hundreds of nonprofits in our network, serving 70 countries around the world, 4.5 million people reached, day schools, synagogues, grassroots organizations. And we're supporting these organizations in a number of ways through programmatic grants, various funding opportunities, resources, and capacity building initiatives. What's really cool today to share with you is one of those areas of capacity building is strategic volunteerism. To date, UJA has invested $10 million in building strategic volunteer programs at 35 organizations. This is work that we've emphasized over the past 8 years. And why do we do this? Volunteerism is a low-cost intervention to sustain and scale the work of nonprofits, addressing priorities today and the needs of their communities tomorrow. Let's talk through what that looks like. Here's a snapshot of our work in fiscal year 22 and the impact that we had. And this is just one slice and one way to tell the story of impact. We invested a total of $1.7 million in 1 year to 20 organizations. And these organizations mobilized volunteers for a total of 194,000 hours. The New York average value of a volunteer hour is $31. And if we do some great math there, we see that the total monetary value of these volunteer hours is $6 million. We put in $1.7 million and we add the value of $6 million. And if we do the math around staffing, we see that those hours equate to 93 full-time equivalent professionals. This is one way to tell the story around the impact of our investment, but it does not refer to or highlight really here the social emotional impact of volunteers or the impact that these volunteers are having on the services and programs that they're making possible. So what were UJA's strategies to drive this impact? We work at various levels. I'm going to talk us through 3 different strategies. Firstly, at an agency level, we work with individual organizations to coach them on how to create strategic volunteer programs. How do we do this? We hire excellent volunteer engagement consultants, some of which are on this call, to coach organizations on how to operate strategic volunteer programs. Organizations learn how to recruit, onboard, retain volunteers, as well as to identify which programs are most strategic for volunteers to be incorporated. As examples, you see on this on their screen, the space of food pantries, employment services, older adult, and mental health. These are some of the priority areas that we had as a philanthropy. And we hypothesized around not only providing programmatic grants to expand services in these spaces, but what if we paired those programmatic grants or provided grants to help organizations expand the work that they were able to do with volunteers? And we've definitely seen that impact. So that coaching is that first step. And then as a way to help organizations incorporate these best practices that they've learned through the coaching, we help to then fund volunteer engagement programs at organizations. And these are some of the funds that we're willing to fund at organizations: volunteer engagement professionals, the salaries, volunteer recognition expenses, volunteer reimbursements, training for volunteers, background checks, and volunteer tracking software. There are a bunch of other expenses. These are just some examples of the expenses we typically see on a budget request. And then we work at different levels. I work with my colleagues who are sitting right next to me that manage various grant portfolios. And we think about the priorities they have within their grant portfolios and how volunteers can be leveraged in those areas. And we recommend that they think about language in their funding applications to encourage organizations to think about volunteers as part of the program. And then so much so we recommend that organizations embedding volunteers into their program request funds to support volunteer expenses. So here's an example of a program budget that's supporting older adults. And you see our great red arrow there. The organization included funds for a volunteer coordinator to support this program. And this is being funded by one of my other colleagues. So we're thinking about volunteerism at various altitudes. Next. And at the highest altitude, we're looking to shift the way the field views strategic volunteerism. As funders, we provided, and Jeff mentioned that we manage a general operating support process around $34 million. Organizations receive an application to apply for those funds, and one of the 30 questions that are asked are on this screen. In what ways do volunteers help your organization elevate program outcomes for clients, increase or expand the delivery of service, or add value to the overall organization? Does your agency currently have a professional who's focused on managing volunteers? This is our way to communicate to the field, to these organizations receiving these dollars, that volunteerism is an indication to us that you are an excellent organization making use of all resources available to you. And we even add that last piece in around, do you have a professional managing volunteers, as an indication that this is a professionally run program, a strategy that your organization takes very seriously and is prioritizing in terms of funding. So I want to try and answer 2 questions. What can funders do now? My favorite is ask the question. When you're meeting with a nonprofit organization, Ask them how they currently use volunteers within their overall organization or a specific program or service. Or even better, ask them how they might envision using volunteers if they have the resources to support that strategy. Next, incorporate language into requests for applications. That's something that we've discussed today. If you're putting out a request for applications and you know that volunteers might be used, ask organizations to put in funds related. We see so many in our organizations put in budgets and they have all kinds of line items, but I rarely see a line item related to volunteer expenses. And we know most times that volunteers are essential to many of the programs that we're funding. Include volunteer language in funder guidelines, simple. Lastly, provide coaching and or training for organizations on how to integrate volunteers. When I said that volunteerism is a low-cost strategy, it's not a no-cost strategy, but when we think about it in our work, coaching organizations, it costs us between $5,000 to $10,000 to coach an organization on how to strategically use volunteers. And the organizations, after a year of working with an engagement professional, are completely transformed. And some of those expenses that we discussed related to funding the volunteer program are low cost and are transformative. What can nonprofits do? Same as up top, ask the question, explore how volunteers can help sustain, expand, or improve programs. Oftentimes, this takes a kind of team within the organization to go around and think at many different layers about the use of volunteers. Next, they can hire a volunteer engagement consultant, low cost. Educate funders and stakeholders on how volunteers impact your organization. So maybe your organization is not the step where you're collecting metrics on hours, but you definitely have those stories. Track them, write them down, and start to share them. And lastly, ask funders to support volunteer expenses. This is something that we'll talk about today. That is a funder working at a philanthropy in many different areas. We rarely see organizations asking, and the answer is usually yes. So take the chance and ask funders to support volunteer expenses. Thank you so much for having me. I want to turn over to my colleagues, Dr. Sue Carter Kahl and Dr. Nathan Dietz. I have some beautiful biographies to share. Dr. Sue Carter Kahl, independent scholar and president of Sue Carter Kahl Consulting. Dr. Kahl has dedicated her professional life to working and volunteering within the nonprofit sector. She uses this experience and expertise as an evaluator, writer, facilitator, and trainer for national, state, and local clients. Sue demystifies and translates research, making it accessible and even exciting. We're looking forward to it. She helps organizations collect and make meaning from their data to enhance organizational decisions. She is a dot connector, meaning maker, and storyteller. Sue is a nationally recognized expert on volunteer engagement and an active volunteer herself. Sue has a PhD in leadership from the University of San Diego. She has a master's in social work administration and a certificate in nonprofit management. And next, Dr. Nathan Dietz is an associate research professor at the University of Maryland and serves as the senior researcher at the Do Good Institute. Dr. Dietz joined the School of Public Policy in March 2017 as an associate research scholar after more than 20 years of conducting and managing research projects in government, the nonprofit sector, and academia. His research with the Do Good Institute focuses on social capital, volunteering, charitable contributions, civic engagement, and social entrepreneurship. Since 2013, he has held an appointment as Senior Research Associate at the Center on Nonprofits and Philanthropy and at the Urban Institute. He earned his master's degree and a PhD in political science from the University of Rochester and earned a bachelor's degree with a dual major in political science and mathematical methods in social sciences from Northwestern University. Thank you so much. Looking forward to learning.
Okay. Thank you, Rina. I think first of all, it's just so great to see so many people here. I'm looking at the number of participants hover around 900, occasionally get over the bar, but and I'm probably, given the time, I'm probably not going to make it through all my slides. I might, but I want to talk about the study in general that we did with the Dugan Institute. This was a study that my research partner and director of the Dugan Institute, Bob Grimm, and I actually have been working on for quite some time. Before we started working on this project, we worked on a similar project about 20 years ago when we were federal employees working for the Corporation for National and Community Service. And what we've done, I think, with this report, among other things, is to follow up on the research that we did 20 years ago with the Urban Institute. So we did 2 surveys for this study. One was of nonprofit CEOs, and one was of representatives of funding organizations. And I'm going to take you through some of the main results from these 2 surveys. On the first survey, the nonprofit CEO survey, we had over 1,200 responses. And the sample of respondents overall was pretty representative of the nonprofit sector. Probably overrepresented were small organizations, but in terms of age, size, measured by revenues and mission orientation, it was pretty, there we go, pretty representative of the sector. One, and we hit on a number of topics. One, of course, given the times, was the effect of COVID on program operations for these organizations. And what we found in general was that many organizations were trying to do much more than they had been doing over the past year in terms of trying to meet demand for organizational services, deliver more services to people. And one of the only ways in which they could actually manage this is to ask their staff to work more hours. Some organizations had a decline in funding, but many had an increase in funding. But we saw that these organizations overall were trying to meet the demands of their communities for needed services. And in general, these organizations didn't have fewer resources devoted to volunteer management, volunteer engagement. We had about as the same percentage of organizations having a professional working in volunteer engagement in 2022 as we had in 2003, about 62%. The difference between the pandemic, before the pandemic, and volunteer engagement during the pandemic is that fewer organizations had absolutely nobody serving in that role. They either had a professional or a volunteer, and that's encouraging because the demand for services provided by volunteers didn't decline. So as I mentioned, one thing we were able to do directly with this study is to measure change over time in terms of the ways in which organizations perceive the benefits and the challenges of volunteer engagement. Because as Rina said, it isn't free to involve volunteers, that resources need to be devoted to that. What we found is that many organizations had most organizations saw that the list of benefits that were taken from previous surveys, especially benefits like allowing the organization to provide services that it couldn't otherwise provide. Most nonprofit CEOs agreed that this was a benefit that volunteerism could provide to a great extent. And that went for almost all of the benefits that are on the list of benefits that the survey respondents talked about on the survey. The percentages were much higher than they were on the pre-pandemic study that was done in 2019 by the original principal investigators of the 2003 survey. And that indicates that people recognize the value of volunteerism much more during the pandemic than they did even right before. But the challenges of volunteer engagement, again, nonprofit CEOs recognized that there were many of those. Probably the biggest one, the single biggest one, was that organizations had trouble finding enough volunteers to actually provide needed services. Also, a large percentage said that they had trouble finding volunteers who were available during the workday and recruiting volunteers with the right skills or experiences. But in the same way as CEOs saw that there were many benefits to volunteer engagement, they also recognized that the challenges were much higher than they were before the pandemic. With the survey, with the study and the 2 surveys that were involved, we were actually able to pretend that the 2 groups of organizations were talking to one another, funding organizations and nonprofit CEOs. We were able to include questions on the CEO survey about whether or not the organization had requested funding from external sources. And 35% of nonprofits said that they hadn't. Many organizations said that the largest number of organizations said that they approached individual donors, but many organizations approached foundations of various kinds, especially private foundations and community foundations. when it came to actually receiving funding from the people, from the sources that they approached, many private foundations actually have the lowest success rate, the lowest funding rate among all groups of foundations. Government agencies probably had the most, but many organizations, most nonprofit organizations who asked any institutional source for funding had a good outcome. So we followed up by asking the people who didn't request funding for volunteer engagement, and we asked them why not. The most common answer was that while our organization has more urgent needs, we don't need to request funding for this because we request funding for other things. But 35% said that they were unsure about how to even ask for funding for volunteer engagement. And 28% said that volunteering doesn't seem like the type of agency that our funders would support. But on the other hand, only 2.2%, this is the small red bar on the top of the graph here, said that their funders have actually discouraged them from asking for funding for volunteer involvement. So that illustrates the point, I think, that nonprofit organizations haven't been told that they can't receive funding, but many of them don't ask for funding for volunteer involvement. And of those that do, maybe they're not sure about how exactly to go about it. On the funder survey, we didn't have a representative sample of funding organizations. We had started with a group of organizations who funded nonprofit organizations in general, and over half said that they funded volunteer involvement for these nonprofit organizations in one way or another. So we asked a lot of follow-up questions, both for the funders, the organizations that funded volunteer involvement, and the non-funders, the organizations that said that they didn't. Many of these organizations in both groups said that funding for volunteer engagement was important, but there were interesting differences between the non-funders and the funders. The non-funders were much more likely to say than the funders were that funding for volunteer engagement helps organizations strengthen connections with other people or organizations in the communities. They were much less likely to say that funding for volunteer involvement helps organizations deliver goods and services compared to funders. But actually forming or strengthening connections, the contributions of volunteering to civil society was actually the most common answer, or the most commonly agreed with answer, among both funders and non-funders. So the last couple slides, I think we were able to compare directly by using the same questions on both surveys, nonprofit organizations and funders, when it came to their ideas about the benefits and challenges of volunteering. And there were some interesting differences here. I think funders thought that were much more likely to agree than with any other benefit that volunteer engagement helps an organization extend its reach within the community. But they were much less likely than nonprofit CEOs to say that funding for volunteer involvement allows the organization to provide services that it couldn't provide. And also much less likely to say that volunteering helps the organization save money. But when it came to the challenges, I think we saw even bigger and more important differences. Funders, only 18.2% of funders said that it was a big challenge for nonprofit organizations to recruit sufficient numbers of volunteers, whereas that was the most commonly cited big problem on the list of questions here. Funders believe, I think, that nonprofits really need funding, that's their biggest problem, that they don't have funding for volunteer involvement, and also that they have problems recruiting volunteers with the right skills or expertise. But they, I think, are not attuned enough to the idea that organizations these days just have a hard time recruiting sufficient numbers of volunteers. So I think the lessons that we draw here are that nonprofit organizations that use volunteers, that involve volunteers in their daily life, very often try to do that without asking for funding from institutional funders. And if they tried, they might have more success with the arguments that talked about the benefits of volunteerism to civil society. And also, to talk about the fact that they're having problems recruiting volunteers these days. And this is where funding can maybe be most effective. I'll stop here. I'm on the thank you slide anyway, but I'll pass this over to Sue, who can follow up, who can talk about the qualitative research that she did.
All right, thanks, Nathan. So the surveys really gave us a chance to get a sense of the landscape for nonprofit leaders as well as funders, but we were really interested in taking a deeper dive, and that's what the qualitative study allowed us to do, was to get a sense of what funders were thinking, or if they were even thinking about investing in volunteer engagement. So this is near and dear to my heart, so I'm really excited to get to finally get those results out in the wild, as I like to think about it. I'm eager to hear your responses and reactions to it. So we engaged leaders from 27 different philanthropic agencies, and they were primarily foundations, although we also had an independent grant-making LLC as well as one public charity. And we conducted 19 interviews and 3 focus groups during August of 22. So that's where our data are coming from. And we're very excited to just be able to talk about some of the highlights from this. We hope you'll dig into the report that you'll get as part of the webinar today to explore it yourself. And first and foremost, we wanted to intentionally use a very wide definition of volunteer engagement, because we know it can cover such a continuum of services and different types of thinking about it. So some of the ways that people talked about it are here on this slide. So it covered everything from traditional and skilled volunteering to civic engagement, community organizing, advocacy, service learning. A whole host of terms and labels were used. And what was interesting to see was that sometimes the same label was used for a different type of activity. So for example, people might talk about civic engagement and mean that it's about getting volunteers from the community to get involved in nonprofits, whereas others were talking about civic engagement as getting out the vote. And so it was easy to see that there could be a lot of confusion because we were using the same terms in different ways, and there were a lot of different terms just in general. In addition, one of the findings was that if I have one conceptualization about civic engagement, for example, being about volunteering in nonprofits, that might hinder me from seeing other conceptualizations of that topic. And so our first recommendation is that we gain clarity. As Rina talked about, defining what volunteer engagement means for a particular organization. If you're a nonprofit, talking about that internally. If you're a grantor, saying what is it exactly that we mean? What does our definition include? Does it exclude any kind of thing? And then sharing that definition or asking for others' definitions so that we're not talking past each other. Our next finding was that volunteers can often be hidden in plain sight. One of the things that the grant makers I talked to said over and over was that volunteers are often essential for the nonprofit partners that they're working with, whether it's an all volunteer organization or a staff volunteer partnership. And yet these volunteer contributions were often going overlooked and unseen. And that showed up when we were asking about, well, what kind of evidence might compel funders to invest in volunteer engagement? And I received a whole lot of different responses that really kind of peeled back the layers on what volunteerism can do and how it can be important for an organization. Some of the highlights in terms of those responses were that they wanted to hear more about the benefits and results of volunteerism. So what was it that volunteers were contributing to an organization's mission? What was it that volunteers were contributing to an organization's operations? They really wanted to have a sense of what does that look like on a day-to-day basis and how does it turn out for the organizations. In addition, another response was that they wanted to know what the value add of engaging volunteers was. So a lot of times we know that when you have a given budget or a given team, volunteers help us go beyond that. They extend our reach and ability to make the most of that. And they wanted to understand more about what kind of leverage volunteers were providing. In addition, they said, sometimes we hear from our grant partners about their volunteers. Mostly if we do, they're talking about the numbers of hours or sometimes a wage replacement rate, like the one posted each year by Independent Sector in April in the US. But they said that doesn't really tell us a whole lot. That tells us about their volunteer volume, but not what their volunteer results are. And so they wanted to know, what do those numbers represent? Is 1,000 volunteers good? Is that enough? Is that too many? Are they able to help the organization meet its mission? So they really were interested in going deeper than we would think a lot of times than the numbers allow us to. And then they were also interested in finding out what kind of pathways did volunteers open up for the agency or even for funder goals. So for example, volunteers not only are a source of labor and talent and expertise, but sometimes they're helping bring other volunteers to the organization. Sometimes they're donors, sometimes they're helping bring in other donors. Sometimes they're making links to other communities that are really valuable for a nonprofit to be connected to. And so the funders said, you know, we're really interested in hearing more about what are these pathways to other goals, because that helped the funders as well. And so it was really interesting after hearing what kinds of evidence would be valuable. I said, well, what kind of evidence do you collect? And more often than not, I heard, excuse me, not much. So it was a really interesting dichotomy where people said there's all of this really compelling, juicy evidence out there, but we're not asking about it. We're not hearing about it proactively from our grant partners either. And so it turned out that there seemed to be a gap between them. Now, I'll be the first to say, I don't think we should be collecting any data unnecessarily or creating burdens from that, but it did tell us that volunteers weren't necessarily part and parcel of how organizations were talking about their work. And so our recommendation here is to think about how we can make volunteer engagement visible. We can do that by focusing on what kind of data are we talking about. When we're talking about the organization's accomplishments, are we including volunteers in that? Are we including that as part of the grant process, as UJA does? Are we putting that into our grant proposals if we're on the nonprofit leader side? Are we talking about data that are meaningful and relevant to our mission? So those numbers that I mentioned earlier might tell us about volunteer volume. How do we also talk about numbers and qualitative data that tell us about, you know, what really does it mean for volunteers to be participating here? And on a related note, as many of us are looking about being more equitable in how we operate as a nonprofit, that includes our data. So what data would be meaningful and relevant about our volunteers to the people that we serve, not just to our external funders and partners? Our next finding was that while there were really holistic needs for volunteer engagement funding, the types of grants that were made tended to be fragmented and pretty focused. And so we found, for example, that a lot of the grant makers said, you know what, volunteers are essential. They should be part of the operations or infrastructure of an organization. It should be an ongoing investment that needs to be sustained over time. And yet the grants that they made tended to be capacity building, one-time, short-term kinds of grants. So for example, they might give a grant for a consultant to help out a board or an executive leadership team, or there might be a grant made to bring some community dialogues together to facilitate and convene. And so there seemed to be a mismatch between the type of funding available and the type of funding that was needed to really be supportive of volunteer engagement in a meaningful way. So our next recommendation is to fund holistically, and that can happen in a couple different ways. One is thinking about how is volunteer engagement built into a funding process from the grant maker standpoint. So there, as Rina mentioned again, you know, that's part of what we're asking about. It's a more formal type of process. On the nonprofit side, you can think about, you know, what does this look like in terms of our volunteers built into the strategic plan? Are we talking about volunteer contributions to our organization goals that we're making? Another way to fund holistically that some of the funders mentioned was multi-year and operating grants. They said that's what their grantees are asking for, and it really allows them the flexibility and adaptability to use the money as they see fit based on very dynamic conditions, as we see are very much the case today. And in other ways, funding holistically meant that funders were joining forces to either pool resources, pool money, to bring additional volunteer engagement to a particular region. Our next finding was really kind of interesting as I stepped back and was looking at the data as a whole and seeing that there really were sort of these tensions or paradoxes involved. And that showed up when we were asking questions about why do funders invest in volunteer engagement, or why don't they invest in volunteer engagement? We received a whole lot of responses about why they would and wouldn't. And so I tried to organize them in terms of what that meant to the community, what it meant to the agency, and what it meant to the funder. And it's very specifically as a Venn diagram, because there was a lot of overlap between the responses. So the first bunch of group was about why do funders invest in volunteer engagement? First and foremost, they said this is a great way to amplify the voices of the community. This is how we equip the community to do the work an organization through nonprofits as well as through grassroots advocacy efforts as well. It also is a way for agency to strengthen and build agency capacity. And then finally, the funders saw that this was a way to advance not only agency goals, but also their own. So funders typically aren't running their own programs, but so they need grant partners to work with them to do that. And they said, you know what, if our effort is about social justice, this is where we're putting our money toward community organizing, for example, with one group. Now, also heard that there were a number of concerns about volunteer and volunteer engagement, and that was one of the reasons that people were not investing in the resource. So one reason was the volunteers in the community themselves. There was a concern that volunteers were not necessarily a reliable or high quality workforce that would be held to the same kind of standards that a paid staff would be. In addition, there was concern not only that funding it could bring capacity to an organization, but did organizations even have capacity to engage volunteers well in the first place? And then as far as our funder, they really fell into two categories. One is being, there was an interest in funding programs over operations. And there was a lot of uncertainty about would this grant really make be a good one. And so our recommendation here is just like in a dance partnership, you have to have a tension between you to create a hold and a connection. We want to, instead of avoiding some of this tension, to really go into it, have an honest conversation, not just about the good parts of volunteerism, but some of the bad and the ugly. How do we get together to problem solve around that internally in nonprofits, as well as between nonprofits and their funders, so that we can create the conditions for volunteerism to be more successful? And I will stop there with the highlights and turn it back over to Jeff and Betsy.
Thank you so much, Sue. And I'm going to add in our panelists here as well as Jeff to let us start taking a few questions. So Jeff, while I'm bringing up the panelists, would you like to kick off the Q&A?
Yes, thanks, Betsy, and thanks to Sue and Nathan and Rina. You all are rock stars in our universe, so thank you. We've got a lot of really great questions that came in during the registration process and of course that are being posted now. If we could start this off, and I'll pose this to all three panelists. Each of you in different ways talked about how organizations can measure the impact of volunteer engagement strategies. And obviously you all note it's more going beyond number of volunteers and number of hours is really critical. Let me put a finer point on it. What would you suggest to a nonprofit CEO around measuring the impact of volunteer engagement if that person is trying to get their board and their funders to understand why this is important? And similarly, if you were talking to a funder who needs to convince their colleagues and perhaps their board to start funding volunteer engagement, how would you encourage them to measure the impact of volunteer engagement? And that's for all three of you.
Happy to jump in. I'll build on Dr. Kahl's presentation, which I see the flow so beautifully. At UJA, we look at the metrics related to volunteerism at three different levels. So the first thing we do is when an organization is beginning the work of integrating these best practices, we look at the before and after. What are the best practices that they had in place and how have those shifted over time? That's softer, maybe not as compelling to a board, but for an organization that's looking to grow and make change, it's nice to be able to track the changes that an organization has made. At the easy, I call one level the easiest level and the next the favorite level. The easiest level is what we've been discussing, with which is the number of volunteers, number of volunteer hours. My favorite metric, and when we have conversations with organizations, we say this is going to become yours too, is the number of volunteer hours. Why? Because you saw within the presentation and related to Dr. Sue, what you shared as well, is that we're able to take the number of volunteer hours and transform it into dollar contribution, which is usually what funders are interested in, as well as boards and various stakeholders. So translating into that dollar value and that staffing value. But my favorite level, and the level that we care a lot about, is to really understand the impact and the results of volunteers. So very specifically, what we'll do is we'll work with a food pantry and we'll say, what are your goals around incorporating volunteers into this program? And let's create metrics at the start and collect some baseline data and see what the results are. So an organization will tell us, we're looking to reduce the wait time. And so we say, okay, what's the wait time now? It's 5 minutes. Once we incorporate volunteers, does that go down to 3 minutes? Now that shows that the volunteers are having a really significant impact. Or we say, how many clients was the pantry able to take on? We saw during COVID that some organizations told us we have enough food, but we can't get the food out. And so are you able to now serve a greater number of clients? Or we're looking to now make deliveries. So you had 0 deliveries to start, and now you have a greater number. And you can do that as it relates to different programs and services and show that impact. Now, the level which is the hardest to collect metrics around is usually the impact that volunteers have on clients. And there's some ethics and great conversations around that, which I won't go into, but of course, we would love to see the stories or collect the stories around how volunteers are impacting. It's great for there to be 30 volunteers at one event, but we also know, and we're also very mindful when we collect those base level data points, that one volunteer can work with one refugee and train them within a specific area to prepare for work. And that is more valuable, or different value, I would say, correct myself, different value than for 30 volunteers at an event. So lots of different layers and ways to tell that story.
That's fantastic, Rina. Thank you. And those are very practical suggestions that both nonprofits and funders can incorporate. Sue or Nathan, do you have anything to add to Rina's observations?
Well,
I will. I clearly was so excited by her responses that I upended my camera. I had a whole dissertation on this, so I will spare you that. But I think just a couple things to add, which are that if your organization is already thinking about organizational or program level data, to think about how do you weave in the volunteer contributions to those outcomes or to those outputs. That's one way to not try to start from scratch, but to weave in something that already exists. And to also think about what is the purpose for involving volunteers in your organization. It's not just to have volunteers, it's to have them accomplish something on behalf of the mission and the operations. So getting clarity around that purpose, and then thinking about what practices will support you in meeting that purpose, and then what data points will tell you if you met that purpose or not. And to think beyond the word metrics even, because it focuses us on something quantitative, whereas the qualitative matters too, in terms of what volunteers are able to contribute to our agencies.
That's good. Thank you so much, Sue. Nathan, you were going to have a comment on this as well.
Only that we asked funders and nonprofit CEOs what were the most important things for nonprofits to do when it came to assessing the impact of volunteer involvement for organizations. And the funder responses were really something. Over 95% said that nonprofits should collect feedback from staff members and from volunteers themselves. And over 80% said that they should collect feedback from community members who receive services. So I wasn't expecting the percentages to be nearly that high. But that is far and away what funders want to see, I think, when it comes to nonprofits' own measurement strategies.
And that's a very powerful statistic and something that can be used on both sides of the transaction. Thank you, Nathan. Betsy.
Yeah, I saw a question earlier that I wanted to pose to Rina, and that was what reaction have other funders or funding organizations had when you've shared your approach at UJA-Federation? Have they been receptive, open? Are they surprised? Just curious as to when you talk to other funders about what you're doing, because we all know this is so transformative. What are they saying to you? Oh, I think you're muted.
So there are usually a lot of aha moments. It sounds very intuitive, right? If you are looking to leverage all resources and you're a savvy funder, why not tap into all human resources possible? And yet what I'll say is most compelling, which is why we have lots of different strategies. We have the greatest success pushing funders or convincing funders to fund volunteer related expenses as part of a program versus to fund a separate department related to volunteer work. So I would say, depending on where you are in that conversation, there are different ways to go about it.
Thank you. Excellent. Jeff, another question from your side.
Thanks, Betsy. And this is a question that came in from actually 2 questions from folks that were in the registration process for today's webinar, but I'm going to smush them together. One was a question about how do you keep volunteers, especially young adult volunteers, sustained and engaged in your organization? And the other question was, what does the future of volunteerism look like? And this person saying, given that many of our current volunteers are aging out. So it's almost the pipeline of how do you bring in the next generation, but also work with folks that may be stepping out or changing the way they want to interact given where they are chronologically. And I can say that as an old person. Practical observations, comments, Sue, Nathan, Rina?
I can start because this is our business. You know, at the Do-Good Institute, we're trying to train young people how to become maybe not social entrepreneurs. Some of them do become great social entrepreneurs, but we want to teach them to be active citizens and, you know, to be able to identify and solve problems within their communities. But they need to have willing partners in order to do that. And nonprofit organizations can do a lot to make that happen. This is not a recent thing. It's not a pandemic related circumstance, but many organizations have always had problems giving young volunteers a good volunteer experience, just making them feel like their work is valued and that it's, you know, the value of having young people work within the organization is really appreciated. In the original 2003 study, we had a lot of people ask why they didn't use young volunteers, because we did ask about the typical age of their volunteers. And they perceived that the costs of managing, this was the term that we used back then, you know, we recognize now that that's probably not the best idea, but engaging young volunteers, we had a lot of organizations tell us that the costs outweighed the benefits. And that's something I think that if you're an organization and you can get past that and you can transmit that, you can make young people understand that that's how you feel, then that could go a long way.
Thank you, Nathan. Sue, any comments on that?
I think one of the things to consider is what are our processes? What are our policies? To whom are those processes and policies welcoming? And a lot of us have found that volunteers tend to be older, they tend to be white, they tend to be better educated and of a higher socioeconomic status. But when you look around at the movements that are happening across the country, and not just in the US, we're seeing young people, we're seeing more ethnic diversity, we're seeing even intergenerational diversity, and we're seeing a real momentum and energy there. And so I think it's a lesson for us to step back and say, we've created volunteering to be welcoming and appealing to a certain demographic or maybe demographics. And to what extent do we need to look at what are, you know, if someone comes here, who finds that welcoming, in what ways, and what do we need to change to reach a broader segment of the community so that our volunteers look like the communities around us?
And I'd love to throw one question in the mix. I'm seeing getting a lot of energy in our Q&A. We know a lot of our participants today, having been poring over the registration list for days now, a lot of you are leaders of volunteers yourselves. And I'm seeing quite a bit of questions around what strategies are there for those who are in that volunteer engagement role? You know, we're talking a lot today about what executive leadership of nonprofits can do, what funders can do, but what can volunteer engagement professionals themselves do to help elevate this and garner more support?
I'll jump in because I think one of the pieces that was really stood out for me was about making volunteers more visible. And I think sometimes we kind of go about our work and think about ourselves as working behind the scenes, and maybe, you know, we don't want to cause a lot of fuss. But I think one of the big functions of a volunteer engagement professional is to advocate for volunteers, to ensure that the work that volunteers are doing is seen, that it is talked about in meaningful ways, that we get it out to our executive leadership, to if we're not already in that team. I know that's a struggle for some, but are we communicating proactively? Are we listening to what's going on at board meetings, or looking at the strategic plan and talking about here's how volunteers are helping, or here's how they could help? We need to think about how we can integrate volunteers into those pieces. And even if we're not at that table yet, to think about what kinds of things do we know about the organization, about the organization's pain points, and about how volunteers can help us get there. And then to tell anyone who will listen to us, and even those who don't, I think just being consistent, professional, and talking about that not just the numbers, but the impact. Why is it important to program, or why is it important to the operations?
I'll add that I had one organization years ago, and then I made it an ask of many of our grantees add us to their list, their distribution list that they would send to their volunteer pool of volunteer opportunities. And that is the greatest marketing tool. So as a funder, I am constantly seeing from a local JC Jewish Community Center or from a social service organization a list of opportunities, and they are constantly on my radar in that way. And it's a simple way they're already marketing these opportunities. So why not include your board in these email communications, other stakeholders, funders, etc.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Do we have time for one more, Jeff, do you think, or?
Let's try to sneak one in.
All day.
Yeah. Each of our panelists had such depth of findings and experience, but I'm wondering, if there's one message, one key piece of knowledge that you would like to leave the webinar participants with today, what's that thing that they can take back to their organization, whether they're a nonprofit or a funding agency?
Nathan, go ahead. Why don't we start with you?
I would say, my advice would be for nonprofits and not leaders of nonprofit organizations. If there ever was a time to modernize the approach that you take to involving volunteers, from recruiting volunteers, maybe not the right idea, but finding ways to engage volunteers in your organization's activities, to keeping them engaged and been satisfied and happy. Whatever you can do to expand the range of virtual volunteering opportunities, to make sure that people have access to flexible schedules, all the things that people have told nonprofit organizations they should be doing to engage more volunteers for years and years before the pandemic. It's absolutely essential now. And if they can do it, I mean, you don't have to do everything, but business as usual, I think, pretty much ground to a halt for most organizations in mid-2020. So if you're an organization that is still trying to engage volunteers, then try something new. I think there are a lot of options there, and every single one of them can be helpful.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nathan. Sue?
Yeah.
Or Rina,
oh, we were tripping on each other. Sorry, I called out Rina first. Sorry, Rina, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say quickly to start small. It can be an overwhelming space to enter. What we see when we approach organizations and think about strategic volunteerism work, we ask them to pick one area of work, one program or service that they'd like to see volunteers being used, and we work with them in just that one space. And the strategy is that after a couple of years, we see volunteers are being integrated throughout the organization, but it's that small one step, one program or service, collecting the stories in that area and really feeling compelled and excited around that space and garnering that buy-in for that area of work.
Super. Thanks, Rina. Sue, the last word before we wrap up.
Invest in volunteer engagement the way you would for anything you want to be successful. I mean, the only difference really between that slide with the benefits Venn diagram and the challenges was that organizations had invested in it, put resources toward it and intention toward it, and they received the benefits and challenges, or the benefits.
Thank you. Fantastic advice and counsel. Appreciate that very much.
So Jeff, do you want to wrap us up? I know folks have to jump to their next sessions here.
Indeed. Well, thank you to our panelists, Nathan, Rina, Sue, again, fantastic. And just keeping an eye on the chat, it sounds like our participants have found this really valuable. You can now download the Do Good Institute report in its entirety and Dr. Carter Kahl's report in its entirety at strategicvolunteerengagement.org. We'll drop the link into the chat, which I think has happened already. And right now you also see the QR code. You can scan that as well. At our website, you'll be able to rewatch this webinar as well as other webinars we'll be posting, and look for additional tools, information, and research as we go forward. Betsy, anything
Thank
to
you.
wrap up?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us today. And this is just the beginning of a much needed conversation. So go forth, share this with the folks in your circles, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. We have your information and you'll be hearing from us. So thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.